Justice William Alsup sits above the chamber, his robe draped like a cloak of untouchable power. His eyes glimmer with quiet derision, and for a moment it feels as though dignity itself has been mocked. They would call it later the smirk seen across America. For the millions watching, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not the calm face of wisdom, nor the impartial judge of truth. No, this was arrogance in its purest form, condescending, smug, almost daring anyone in the room to challenge him. It was the look of a man who believed his position alone was victory enough. And that smirk, more than words, more than rulings, told the nation exactly how he viewed those beneath him. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Every heartbeat in that chamber seemed to echo. Every gaze shifted to the one person who had not flinched, not bowed, not faltered, Representative Jasmine Crockett. Where others saw an unassailable wall of authority, she saw something different. She saw weakness hiding behind performance. She saw the face of a man who underestimated not just her, but the millions whose voices she carried. And in that instant, the confrontation became something greater. It was no longer about courtroom decorum or legal technicalities. It was about respect, about whether truth could rise above the weight of a judge's arrogance, about whether one woman's voice could puncture the shield of power that had silenced so many before. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens, sensing something electric in the air. On Twitter, whispers began, "Did you see that? Did you see his face?" Clips were already being rewound, zoomed in, shared. The nation's collective pulse quickened, and then came the question no one could answer yet. What would she do? How could anyone stare down a smirk sharpened by decades of authority? In that moment, the line between arrogance and justice was drawn. And what happened next left even his critics stunned into silence. The hearing was never meant to be ordinary. It wasn't just another clash of personalities, another round of Washington theater. It was a moment weighted with the full gravity of America's story. Immigration, dignity, belonging. These were not abstract policies written in sterile language on parchment. They were lived realities, etched into the hearts of millions who had crossed borders, chased dreams, and built lives in the face of hardship. And on this day, all those struggles stood trial not in words alone, but in the smirk of a man who thought he could decide whose voice mattered. Justice William Alsup represented more than a judge with a robe. To many, he embodied the old guard, the fortress of power that so often treated communities of color, immigrants, and the working poor as though their very existence was an inconvenience. His smirk was not a quirk. It was a declaration. I am untouchable and you are small. And yet that very arrogance, broadcast live across the country, began to backfire. Because in every living room, on every smartphone, in every whispered conversation, people felt it, the sting of that smirk, as if it were aimed at them. But dignity has always been America's secret weapon. From the marches of Selma to the protests at airports when families were nearly torn apart, dignity has been the unshakable current beneath every demand for justice. And sitting just across from Alsup, Jasmine Crockett embodied it. Calm, poised, unwavering. She carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who knew she wasn't speaking for herself alone. She was a vessel for millions who had been told to wait, to be quiet, to accept less. Her very presence unsettled the arrogance of the bench. The stakes stretched far beyond that room. To lose here, to let Alsup's smirk go unanswered, was to concede that arrogance still held dominion, that dignity could be mocked without consequence. But to answer it, to pierce it, to silence it, would mean something extraordinary. Proof that truth, spoken with courage, could still bend even the mightiest institutions. The tension was unbearable, the balance delicate. Commentators whispered about whether Crockett would challenge him, or whether she would retreat into the shadows, as so many had before when faced with judicial disdain. After all, who dares confront a judge? Who risks their career, their reputation, their future, to call out power directly? And yet Crockett's silence was not submission. It was strategy. She let the smirk linger, let the arrogance grow, let the cameras capture every flicker of Alsup's superiority. Because she knew The longer arrogance strutted unchecked, the sweeter its collapse would be. The audience could sense it too. Something was building. The story was no longer about legal arguments or political points. It was about who America would choose to be. A nation resigned to sneers from above, or a nation where dignity still had the power to humble even the most arrogant. And just when it seemed Alsup would dominate, when his smirk had grown into the symbol of unchallenged authority, a voice rose that no one expected. For years, William Alsup had built his reputation not just on rulings, but on demeanor. In the corridors of power, he was whispered about with a mix of awe and irritation, a judge who carried himself like the final word in any conversation. Colleagues said he had an eye for detail, but critics pointed out it was often wielded as a weapon, not a tool of fairness. Behind the robe lay a man who mistook power for respect, who believed the authority of his seat made him untouchable. His history was a tapestry woven with decisions that revealed both brilliance and arrogance. On some days, he seemed to stand for justice. On others, his rulings carried the unmistakable scent of elitism, the idea that those who had struggled the hardest deserved the least sympathy. He enjoyed the stage the courtroom gave him, a stage where he could lecture, interrupt, and dominate. To the outside world, this was judicial rigor. To those who sat across from him, it often felt like Theater 1, where he never played the role of listener. That smirk, the one America would see, had roots stretching back decades. Law clerks remembered it. Attorneys dreaded it. It was his calling card, his subtle way of saying, "I've already won, you just don't know it yet." To some it was confidence. To others, it was contempt wrapped in charm. And yet, whether in high-profile cases or in moments unnoticed by history, that expression never failed to send the same message. Alsup saw himself not merely as an arbiter of the law, but as the law itself. It was this contradiction that defined him. Here was a man charged with upholding justice, yet so often blind to the human dignity standing before him. He could cite precedent with surgical precision, but when confronted with the stories of ordinary families, immigrants, workers, people clawing for a piece of the American dream, he betrayed little warmth, little understanding. Power fascinated him, empathy not so much. To the public, the robe gave him credibility. The bench gave him stature. But strip all that away, and what remained was a man who craved dominance. His courtroom was not a space of equals, but an arena where his smirk was the referee, his interruptions the scorecard, his word the final bell. This was not respect freely given. It was compliance extracted, and over the years it hardened into habit. Yet arrogance carries a flaw, one written in the oldest stories of downfall. Pride blinds, hubris deafens. The very tools that make a man seem invincible become the cracks that shatter his image when the right challenge appears. Alsup's smirk was more than a tic. It was his mask, and his mask was slipping. Every movement he made that day was broadcast. Every curl of his lip, every flicker of his brow, every half-hidden chuckle underlined not his strength, but his disdain. He thought the robe shielded him, that his elevated seat insulated him from accountability. But the nation was watching, not through the filter of deference, but through the raw lens of outrage. Ordinary people saw in him every teacher who dismissed them, every boss who belittled them, every system that told them to sit down and stay quiet. The smirk that once silenced suddenly provoked, and therein lay his fatal miscalculation. Alsup had spent so long wielding his authority unchallenged that he forgot what happens when arrogance meets courage. He believed that his opponent would fold, that dignity could be mocked into retreat. But arrogance is often loudest before it falls, and pride beams brightest just before the light is snuffed out. That smirk, magnified across millions of screens, was not the symbol of a man in command. It was the emblem of a man out of touch, too blinded by his own self-importance to see the storm gathering in front of him. He had underestimated Jasmine Crockett, underestimated her voice, underestimated the power of composure against contempt. And so, while he smiled at what he believed was another easy victory, he was already standing on the edge of his greatest humiliation. He didn't know it, but the nation was waiting. The cameras were rolling. The silence was heavy. But little did he know, The stage was already set for his undoing. Long before she ever set foot in a chamber where cameras rolled and judges smirked, Jasmine Crockett was fighting battles the nation never saw. Born into a world that didn't hand out favors, she learned early what it meant to push against the current. While others had doors opened for them, she found doors slammed in her face, each rejection shaping her grit, each setback chiseling away fear until all that remained was resolve. Her story was not gilded with privilege. It was carved from sacrifice. As a young woman, she juggled jobs while chasing an education, not because she wanted to prove anything to others, but because survival demanded it. Bills piled up, opportunities seemed distant, but determination pushed her forward. She had watched too many in her community silenced, ignored, treated as statistics rather than human beings, and she vowed quietly, stubbornly, that she would not allow herself to be just another story dismissed by power. Her first steps into public service were not glamorous. They were messy, exhausting, and often thankless. She worked in courtrooms defending those who could never afford the luxury of high-priced representation. The immigrant, the laborer, the young man accused before he even spoke. Every case she took wasn't just about law, it was about dignity. She knew the stakes weren't measured in rulings alone, but in whether families could sleep at night, whether children could dream, whether voices long muted could finally be heard. The hours were brutal, the pay modest, but Crockett thrived not on comfort, but on conviction. She saw in each client's eyes the reflection of her own journey, the fight to be taken seriously in a world too eager to look away. And as she stood before judges, often facing dismissive glances or interruptions, she began to understand something vital. Arrogance could sit high on the bench, but dignity could stand taller in the heart. That understanding gave her strength when others faltered. She wasn't intimidated by titles or robes. She had already seen the raw edges of injustice up close. She had sat across from mothers clutching eviction notices, fathers deported overnight, students whose futures were written off by a single mistake. Their stories became her armor. Their pain became her fire. When she entered politics, some dismissed her as too raw, too unpolished, too unwilling to play by the rules of quiet deference. But the very qualities others mocked were the ones that drew people to her. She didn't speak like someone rehearsing lines. She spoke like someone who had lived them. She didn't campaign with lofty promises alone. She campaigned with scars, with memory, with the authenticity of someone who had carried the weight of her people's struggles. Her rise was not smooth. She faced the sneers, the whispers, the doubts. But with each obstacle she grew sharper, steadier, more relentless. The underdog narrative wasn't just branding, it was her life. And people saw in her what they longed to see in themselves. A fighter who refused to be silenced. A voice that cut through noise with truth. Every sacrifice she made, every late night preparing cases, every battle in the trenches of her community, became part of a larger story. And that story gave her a weapon more powerful than any title could offer: moral strength. It wasn't the kind you could inherit or purchase or fake. It was forged through lived experience, through resilience, through an unbreakable belief in the dignity of ordinary people. So when Jasmine Crockett sat across from Justice Alsup, watching his smirk ripple through the chamber, she wasn't merely a representative in office. She was the culmination of every struggle her community had endured, every overlooked voice that finally demanded to be heard. To him, it may have seemed like a clash of status, a judge on high, a representative below. But to her, it was personal. It was ancestral. It was history speaking through her, demanding respect. She remembered the faces of clients who never got their day in court, the workers who never received justice, the families fractured by cold rulings that treated them like numbers. She carried them with her into that room, and in that moment, as Alsup's smirk widened with unearned confidence, Crockett's resolve sharpened into something unstoppable. Because arrogance can laugh, but dignity does not flinch. And when that smirk appeared, all of that history came pouring back with fire. The chamber grew colder with every word that fell from Justice Alsup's lips. His voice, clipped and precise, carried not the weight of fairness but the sting of condescension. He leaned forward slightly, robe shifting as though to remind the room of his authority, and with each sentence he sharpened his tone. What should have been a dialogue now felt like a performance, one where Alsup played the role of overlord, dismissing Crockett's points with a wave of arrogance disguised as intellect. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her expression steady, her body language calm. She didn't flinch at the interruptions. She didn't rise to match his tone. She listened, silent but unshaken, her eyes trained on him not as a student to a master, but as an equal daring him to keep underestimating her. The interruptions came fast, sharper now. Alsup cut across her sentences, dismissing her words with a smirk that had already made its way into the nation's bloodstream. Each time she opened her mouth, he clipped her wings with a phrase, a scoff, or worse silence punctuated by that smile. His message was clear. Her words were not worth his time. But something else was happening in the room, something he seemed blind to. Every smirk was met with a ripple from the gallery, a gasp here, a murmur there, phones tilted upward, recording quietly, fingers typing furiously as live tweets began to flow. He's smirking again. He's not even letting her finish. The audience was no longer just in the chamber. It was across the country, watching in real time as arrogance played out against dignity. The air thickened with tension. Crockett continued to listen, nodding occasionally, her stillness amplifying the contrast. She wasn't cowed, and she wasn't scrambling to shout over him. That calm composure drew in the room like gravity. People leaned forward, sensing that her silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Alsup's smirk widened. He believed he had her cornered. He leaned back, resting his hand against his chin, glancing at the audience as if to say, "Do you see how easily she folds?" To him the silence was submission. To the crowd it was suspense. The whispers grew louder, like the low hum before a storm. One by one, the audience members exchanged looks, as though they were at a sporting event where the underdog team seemed to be holding back, waiting for the perfect moment. The gallery felt like a stadium, its air alive with anticipation. You could almost hear the drumbeat of hearts sinking together. Wait for it. Something's coming. Every second of interruption, every dismissive gesture, every smirk, layered more fuel onto the fire. Crockett's calm became magnetic. People started recording longer clips, whispering into their phones, "She's about to let him have it. Just watch." Alsup pressed harder, mistaking the silence for surrender. His voice grew more animated, his smirk more pronounced, his tone almost mocking now. He thought the audience was his. He thought the cameras loved his command. But arrogance blinds. What he didn't see was how each smug dismissal only made the room root for her more. The atmosphere was no longer judicial. It was gladiatorial. One man swinging his arrogance like a sword, one woman holding her ground like a shield of stone. The crowd bristled with energy, waiting for the clash. And then, just when the arrogance seemed unbearable, when Alsup's smirk stretched as wide as his confidence, Jasmine Crockett inhaled slowly. Her calm eyes never wavered. She was ready, but Crockett wasn't rattled. She was loading her counterstrike. For a moment the chamber was frozen in silence, as though time itself had paused to witness what would come next. Jasmine Crockett's hands rested firmly on the table before her. She leaned in just slightly, her posture unshaken, her eyes locked on Justice Alsup, with the intensity of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment. The room seemed to tilt toward her, every ear straining, every camera fixed. She began softly, not with a shout, not with anger, but with a voice steady enough to make the silence ring louder than Alsup's interruptions. "You've had your say," she said evenly, her words slicing through the air. "Now it's my turn." The gallery shifted, a ripple of anticipation swelling. On the live feeds, comments flew by in real time. "She's about to go off. Watch this. Watch her." Crockett let the weight of her pause settle. She wanted him to lean forward, wanted him to brace himself. And he did. The smirk that had seemed so invincible just seconds earlier twitched, as though uncertain whether it belonged anymore. She continued, her tone calm but cutting. "You sit there in your robe, sir, and you mistake it for a shield. But that robe does not make you right. It does not make you just and it most certainly does not give you the right to mock the dignity of the people who sent me here." Gasps flickered through the crowd. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God," as phones darted upward to capture every word. The hashtag, the smirk, exploded across Twitter, side by side with Yacht Crockett counterpunch. Alsup shifted in his seat, his shoulders stiffening. His smirk lingered, but it was weaker now, strained at the edges. His jaw flexed as though holding back a rebuttal, but Crockett didn't give him room. She pressed forward. "You laugh," she said, pausing for emphasis, "because you think you cannot be touched. But every immigrant who fought for their papers, every worker who stood up for a fair wage, every mother who's been told her children don't belong, they see that smirk. And you've told them exactly what you think of them." The chamber erupted in murmurs, the kind of low roar that signaled something unforgettable was unfolding. Clips of the moment hit TikTok within minutes, slowed down, replayed with dramatic music underlay. Alsup's smirk freezing, Crockett's words slamming like gavel strikes. Crockett leaned back slightly, let the silence breathe, then struck again. "You mistake arrogance for strength. But strength is standing tall when people like you tell us to sit down. Strength is answering contempt with composure. Strength is dignity, sir. And that's something you can't fake with a robe and a smile." This time, the gallery responded audibly, a swell of gasps and even muffled applause before the gavel slammed for order. Online, reaction videos sprouted instantly. Young viewers wide-eyed, mouths covered in disbelief, captions flashing, "She said it." Alsup's body betrayed him. His smirk slipped further, his eyes darting briefly toward the cameras as if to measure how much of this the world had seen. His hands shifted, restless, betraying nerves he could no longer conceal. For the first time, the robe looked less like armor and more like fabric weighed down by exposure. Crockett pressed on, her voice rising not in volume but in certainty. "You thought you could laugh me into silence. You thought you could interrupt until my words disappeared. But here I am, and here are my words, and they will outlast your smirk, your dismissal, even your rulings. Because dignity does not die in the face of arrogance. It rises." The words landed like a hammer strike. Viewers across the country clipped the phrase instantly. Dignity does not die in the face of arrogance. It rises, and plastered it on Instagram stories, Twitter banners, TikTok edits. Memes bloomed. Alsup's fading smirk overlaid with Crockett's words in bold text. She let the room simmer, then added, "And make no mistake, when the people who put me here hear that smirk, they are not intimidated. They are reminded why they fight, why they march, why they vote. You didn't weaken us today. You reminded us of exactly what we're up against. And we will meet it head on." The gallery gasped again, a sound like a stadium hit by a last-second shot. The gavel banged furiously, but even the echoes of wood on wood couldn't drown out the energy coursing through the room. Alsup's smirk was gone now. In its place sat a tightened jaw, eyes narrowed, a face suddenly aware that it was no longer in control of the narrative. The robe had not saved him. Authority had not insulated him. The cameras had caught it all, and the world was choosing sides. Crockett finished with a line that reverberated like a bell. "So laugh if you need to, sir, because the people I speak for aren't laughing. They're rising." The chamber held its breath. Every camera captured the moment, zoomed in on Alsup's face as his lips pressed into a thin line. His smirk vanished entirely. The silence after her words was deafening, more powerful than applause, more damning than jeers. On social media, hashtags surged. "Wow Crockett silences," "Cow smirk no more," "Dignity rises." Commentators went live, replaying the moment in slow motion like analysts breaking down a game-winning shot. One network anchor declared, "This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a cultural earthquake." Inside the chamber, the balance had shifted. The audience's eyes no longer followed Alsup. They followed her. Every gesture, every breath, every syllable felt like a statement not just to him, but to the entire nation. And though the gavel slammed again, though order was demanded, the truth had already slipped out into the world. Crockett had not only answered the smirk, She had buried it under the weight of her words. What happened next was bigger than the courtroom. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words hit the air, they didn't just stay in that chamber. They detonated, echoing through every corner of the digital world like an earthquake whose aftershocks refused to fade. Within minutes, Twitter erupted into a storm that no algorithm could contain. The hashtag #SmirkNoMore shot to the top of the trending list, closely followed by #Crockett silences and Dignity rises. Clips of the confrontation were spliced, subtitled, slowed down, and looped, each one highlighting the exact second Justice Alsup's smirk vanished into thin air. TikTok stitched the moment into every conceivable remix. One creator layered Crockett's takedown over a boxing bell, the caption reading, "Round 1, and she already knocked him out." Another cut the footage to swelling orchestral music, zooming in dramatically as Crockett declared, "Dignity does not die in the face of arrogance. It rises." That clip alone racked up millions of views before the hour was over, accompanied by comments like, "I've never felt prouder watching a politician speak, and she spoke for all of us today." Memes sprouted overnight. A still frame of Alsup's smirk captioned, "Confidence at 9:00 a.m., followed by his smirk fading captioned, "Reality by 9:05. Side-by-side comparisons showed Crockett calm and composed under the text, "Power," contrasted with Alsup's unraveling face under privilege crumbling. Twitter users replaced their profile pictures with Crockett mid-sentence, as though carrying her fire in their own identities. The press moved just as fast. Headlines splashed across news outlets. "The smirk that died. Crockett's takedown reverberates nationwide. Arrogance meets dignity and dignity. Wins. Mic drop heard around the country." Commentators, who usually reserved their praise, were effusive. One late-night host quipped, "That smirk didn't just disappear, it entered the witness protection program." Cable news panels replayed the moment in slow motion, narrating every flicker of Alsup's expression like sports analysts dissecting a championship game. Progressive voices hailed it as proof that arrogance could be shattered when confronted with courage. Even some moderates admitted grudgingly that Crockett's restraint, followed by her precision strike, had made Alsup look not authoritative, but small. But the ripple effect extended far beyond media. In immigrant communities, the video was played in barbershops, living rooms, cafes. Parents pointed to Crockett and told their children, "See? That's why we keep fighting." Activists stitched her words into rally chants. College students shared the clip with captions like, "This is why I'm studying law. This is why I march." For them, it wasn't just a viral moment. It was validation proof that dignity could still triumph, even when mocked, even when interrupted. Online, people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before now treated her like a cultural icon. Fan accounts were created overnight. Artists posted digital paintings of her standing tall, light shining behind her, Alsup fading into the shadows. Musicians sampled her words into beats. She was no longer just a representative. She was a symbol, a vessel of defiance turned into inspiration. Even politicians who often avoided taking sides weighed in. Tweets from prominent figures called her performance a masterclass in composure under fire. Others noted how her words reframed the conversation, shifting the spotlight from Alsup's authority to the dignity of those he dismissed. For once, the narrative wasn't about power controlling the room. It was about power losing its grip. And while social media turned the event into entertainment, its deeper effect was undeniable. People weren't just laughing at the memes. They were reflecting on what that smirk represented. It became shorthand for every time someone had been underestimated, mocked, or silenced. It became a cultural rallying cry. The smirk was arrogance, and its erasure was justice. Alsup, once so certain of his untouchable image, now faced the humiliation of seeing his face turned into a symbol of defeat. He had underestimated how fast culture moves, how quickly one gesture can redefine a legacy. What he thought was harmless superiority had become his greatest liability. And through it all, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't bask. She didn't need to. Her words were doing the work for her, echoing across screens, carried by millions who finally felt seen in her defiance. The world laughed, cheered, and praised. But underneath the celebration, something more enduring was taking shape. Because Crockett's final words in that chamber weren't just a clapback, they were a creed. A declaration meant to outlast the memes, the hashtags, even the headlines. But Crockett's final words carried a weight far beyond memes. When the noise of headlines and hashtags began to settle, what lingered was not the smirk, not even the memes. It was the message. Jasmine Crockett had not simply silenced a judge in a chamber. She had reframed an age-old confrontation into a universal truth. In that instant, arrogance had been unmasked, and dignity had been crowned victorious. She reminded the nation that true justice has never worn a smirk. It has never been found in the mocking grin of the powerful or in the dismissive tone of those perched above others. Justice, she made clear, lives in the unshakable courage of those who refuse to bow their heads when mocked, who refuse to shrink when dismissed. Her words resounded. Justice is not in the smirk of the powerful, but in the courage of the silenced. That line became more than a rebuttal, it became a rallying cry. It echoed through classrooms where students debated fairness, through churches where sermons drew on her words, through union halls where workers demanded their dignity be respected. It was a reminder that America's soul has always been shaped not by the sneers of authority, but by the resilience of ordinary people who refuse to be erased. Crockett's message transcended politics. It spoke to universal values: fairness, integrity, belonging. She told the nation, in effect, that arrogance might win the microphone for a moment, but dignity wins the future. And in a country stitched together by countless immigrant stories, by generations who faced derision but pressed forward anyway, her voice was a continuation of that struggle, a spark carried from the past into the present. It was no longer about one judge or one chamber. It was about every person who had ever felt small under the weight of condescension. Crockett turned that confrontation into an invitation for all who had been silenced to find their voice, for all who had been underestimated to rise, for all who had been mocked to remember that laughter fades. But truth endures. This was the crescendo, the moment where the story lifted from conflict to clarity. She showed America that strength does not come from belittling others, but from lifting them. That real Americanness is not defined by power hoarded at the top, but by dignity defended in the streets, in the classrooms, in the homes of every family who dreams of something better. And so, while Justice Alsup's smirk died in that chamber, Crockett's words lived on, seeded into the consciousness of a nation hungry for examples of courage. They proved that arrogance is temporary, but dignity is timeless. She ended her statement not with bitterness, but with hope. This moment, she said, isn't about me or him. It's about us, all of us. And as long as arrogance rises, dignity will rise higher. The chamber fell silent, but the silence was no longer suffocating. It was reverent. For in her words, people saw themselves. In her defiance, they saw possibility. In her calm strength, they saw a reflection of what America could be when it chose courage over contempt. And that's why this story won't end here. Alsup smirked. Crockett silenced him. That's the story the cameras captured, the internet shared, and the nation felt in its bones. A single moment, a single exchange, where arrogance believed it could laugh unchecked, and dignity answered with words that will echo far beyond that chamber. But this isn't just about one judge or one representative. It's about what we choose to celebrate as a people. Do we applaud the smirk of power, or do we lift up the courage of those who refuse to be silenced? Do we allow arrogance to define our future, or do we demand a country where respect and fairness stand taller than mockery? Crockett's words gave us more than a viral clip. They gave us a reminder. Dignity is not fragile. It doesn't crumble under laughter. It doesn't bow to authority. Dignity rises, always so long as we choose to carry it forward. And that's where you come in. If you believe dignity defeats arrogance, share this moment. Let it spread beyond the screen and into the conversations around dinner tables, classrooms, and workplaces. Let it be more than a meme. Let it be a movement. Subscribe to this channel. because these stories matter. They remind us not just of what's wrong, but of how it can be challenged, reshaped, defeated. Join this community of people who refuse to let arrogance have the last word, who believe that America's true strength lies not in the smirk of the powerful, but in the resilience of the people. Be part of this story. Be part of this movement. Because when arrogance smirks again, and it will take all of us to rise together and silence it with dignity.